Chapter 6. Ben opens the front door the moment the bell rings. His mom comes up behind him in the doorway. Mrs. Tibbets is dressed in old jeans, a brown canvas jacket, and the same leather hiking boots she wears at school. "Hello, Ben, you must be Mrs. Maroney. I'm Gloria Tibbets." She holds out her hand. "I'm so happy you called," his mom says as she shakes the teacher's hand. "Would you like me to pick him up?" "Oh, no, no," the teacher says. "I'll bring him right back after we get the work done and have a bite to eat." Normally, the word bite means to cut with the teeth. But in this case, a bite to eat is a small meal that can be eaten quickly. Take a moment to think about a time when your family ate a meal quickly. Mrs. Tibbets' car is a beat-up old station wagon. Ben has trouble getting the passenger door open until Mrs. Tibbets opens it from the inside. "Darn door," she says. "I don't use it much." Inside, the car is like a storage shed that hasn't been cleaned out for a long time. The back seat is folded down to make more room for all the stacked up boxes and plastic containers. Boots and raincoats are piled on top of the boxes. Spades and shovels and nets, like the ones used for hauling in fish after they're caught, have been thrown in anywhere they'll fit. Mrs. Tibbets gathers the books and papers from the passenger seat and crams them between two boxes in the back. "There, this'll do for now," she says. "But I need to clean this car out in the worst way. It's worse than my desk. Oh, even worse than my brain." She laughs an easy, comfortable laugh. Ben doesn't mind the mess. So if you think about the word mind, you might be thinking about your brain, which is your mind. There is more than one definition for the word mind. So we're going to read the rest of the paragraph, and we're going to think about what that sentence means. Ben doesn't mind the mess. He looks in the back seat, remembering Mr. Tompkins at the Desert Museum and all the equipment the people there used. While he's looking, Mrs. Tibbets keeps talking. So as we look at this, Ben is reminded of something positive, the Desert Museum. He doesn't mind the mess. In this case, if you don't mind something happening, it means you don't care about it happening. So in this case, Ben doesn't care about the mess. "I really appreciate your help today. I know kids don't like to give up their Saturdays, but I have to move some things around in the yard and I just can't do it all by myself. You'll see. Hopefully no one will bother us and we can get some work done." Mrs. Tibbets checks the rearview mirror and backs out of his driveway. "You can open the windows if you want." Ben rolls the windows down. The air is warm and the sun is shining. There aren't any leaves on the trees yet, but it feels like things are coming back to life. He looks over at Mrs. Tibbets as she drives. He's never ridden in a teacher's car before, let alone been to a teacher's house. "Will your husband be there to help too?" he asks. Mrs. Tibbets keeps her eye on the road. "My husband died last year, so I'm afraid he won't be much help today. If he could, he would. He loved being outdoors." Ben swallows. He feels horrible. He should have figured them out by himself. That's why she left school for a while. He fumbles for something else to say, but Mrs. Tibbets keeps talking. "I really do need the help. That's why I ask. And it sounds like you enjoy being outside." Ben nods. "In Tucson, I spent a lot of time outdoors. A lot by myself and with my friend Toby." It's Mrs. Tibbets' turn to nod. It strikes Ben that they've both been talking about someone they've lost, though moving away from your best friend is nothing like losing someone you're married to. He sneaks another look at Mrs. Tibbets. Maybe that's why her eyes look sad even when she laughs. She keeps looking straight ahead. He can't think of anything else to say. "You live pretty close to me as the crow flies," Mrs. Tibbets said. "Those woods behind your house connect to the woods behind mine, although it would be hard to find your way through. But I have lots of frogs on my property too. Several different kinds." Go back to the first sentence in this paragraph. "You live pretty close to me as the crow flies." In this sentence, Mrs. Tibbets is using an expression to show that Ben lives pretty close to him. "As the crow flies" is an expression here that means in a straight line. It's better when she does all the talking, Ben thinks. She goes on. "American toads will be coming out pretty soon, and even some spadefoots." Spadefoots? Ben has heard of spadefoots, but he doesn't know much about them. "Right," Mrs. Tibbets says. "Eastern spadefoots. They're very rare around here. This is as far north as they get, but we've got some." She turns off the main road onto a winding street. They drive past a wooded lot with no houses and then pull into a driveway. He peers out the car window. The little house is set way back from the street, but there's hardly any lawn. Instead, there are bushes and trees and large flower beds covered with straw. The car comes to a stop and Ben gets out. He sees a one-car garage to his left, connected to a house by a covered walkway. A couple of bare, gnarled trees loom over the front porch. "Looks like a pretty old house," Ben says. "The oldest part is 140 years old," Mrs. Tibbets says. "Almost older than me." Ben looks at her. "That's a joke," Mrs. Tibbets says. "We can tell that's a joke because humans don't live to be much more than 100. It's pretty rare for them to be that old." So Mrs. Tibbets was making a joke, but Ben didn't quite get the joke. "Come around back and I'll show you what to do." They walk to the back of the house. It faces south, so the morning sun is reflecting off the window panes. The backyard stretches out into a meadow of tall, uncut tawny grass with woods at the far end. Tawny is a word here which means an orange, brown, or yellowish brown. So I can use that to tell you that the grass is probably dying just a little bit. Small trees and bushes are arranged in rough lines over the part of the meadow. Just beyond the garage, Ben sees what looks like a fenced-in vegetable garden with piles of brush and weeds heaped nearby. Off to the left, a hill rises steeply with bare outcropping of rocks crowning its top. It looks like a great place to explore. As if reading his mind, Mrs. Tibbets says, "Want to look around a bit before we get to work?" "Sure." He follows his teacher out to the middle of the field, and they stop and stand by the rows of bushes. "These are blueberries," Mrs. Tibbets says, fingering one of the bare branches. "The birds get most of them." "Is this all your land?" Ben asks. "Yes," she says. "Well, mine and my sister-in-law's." Sister-in-law means it is the sister of her husband. In-laws mean that they are related to you through marriage. Such as, not that any of you are married yet, but when you do get married, your husband or wife's parents or their siblings. Ben looks back at the house. There's a big tool shed behind the garage. "Is this a farm or something?" he asks. "It was. Once upon a time, my husband's father farmed it, and his father did too. But they weren't serious farmers. It's hard to farm here because the soil is very rocky. A lot of the fields have gone back to the woods now. Anyway, Thomas inherited the house and the land right around it. It's where he grew up. He loved it here." Ben notices a little lean-to against the tool shed. A large cage comes up on legs, sits under the lean-to roof. It looks like a rabbit hutch. "What's that?" he asks, pointing. Mrs. Tibbets shakes her head and says, "It's a snake cage." Ben's ears perk up. "Are there snakes in there?" "Yes, my husband kept them." "What kind?" "It doesn't matter," Mrs. Tibbets says. "You must leave them alone and to not go near them." "But are they—" "I'm dead serious. Don't go near the cage. Do you understand me?" Take a moment to make a prediction here. The author gave some clues about what's in the cage. Ben had some ideas. Make a prediction. Is Ben going to listen to what Mrs. Tibbets says? What is going to happen if he does listen to her or if he doesn't? Ben nods. He can tell she doesn't want to talk about it anymore. It only makes him that much more curious. "Let's get to work," Mrs. Tibbets says, "so we'll have time later to look for the frogs." Mrs. Tibbets opens the door of the tool shed. "Wait here. I need to get a few things." Ben can't help staring at the cages. What could be in there? Mrs. Tibbets hands Ben a rake and a big plastic tarp and leads him around to a large flower bed on the side of the house away from the garage. She instructs him to rake up the leaves out of the bed and pile them up on the tarp, and then leaves him there to work in the sun. Soon he's sweating. Just as he's finished with the beds, she reappears and points out a pile of fallen branches. "I want you to drag these limbs out to the back part of the field. Cover for animals," she says. "A place they can hide from hawks." Ben can't remember the last time he worked this hard, but the morning goes by quickly. When he's moved all the branches out to the field, he sits on the rock wall and enjoys the sun for a minute. He's still breathing heavily, but a light breeze cools his face. Now that he's still, he can hear birds singing. "All done?" Mrs. Tibbets calls. She has something that looks like deflated inner tubes draped over her shoulders. Take a minute to use the clues in the text to tell you what the word deflated means. When I read this sentence, I see the word inner tubes. When I think of an inner tube, I think about going tubing at a water park or on the river. If I think of what inflated means, I have full tubes. Deflated means the opposite. Deflated means the tubes do not have very much air in them, or none at all. "I think so," Ben answers. "Let's go for a walk then," she says, and holds up a really long pair of boots. "We'll take these hip waders in case you want to wade in the muck." Ben has seen pictures of boots like these, but he's never worn any. He puts a pair over his shoulders and follows Mrs. Tibbets. She stops at the edge of the woods and points to an opening in the trees. "My husband made this trail years ago. It loops back around through the woods in a big circle and comes out near the garage," she says, and then heads off down the trail at a quick pace. Before Ben knows it, Mrs. Tibbets is down the path, almost 20 yards ahead of him. Ben struggles along, lugging the big boots and following the faint trail. He pushes past a tangle of briars and fallen tree branches and nearly steps on Mrs. Tibbets, who is kneeling by a log. A briar is a type of bush, so it says he pushes past a tangle of briars, so a tangle of bushes. She lifts it up slightly. "Look," she says. Ben squats beside her. Huddled under the log is a little squirmy thing a couple of inches long, with legs and a tail. It has yellow spots up and down its back. Ben gets down on his knees right by Mrs. Tibbets. "What is it?" "A yellow-spotted salamander. It's just waking up now." Ben is impressed. "How'd you know it was there?" "Well, I wasn't sure, but they like moist places, and they usually burrow around roots, so I made an educated guess." She seems to know something about everything on this trail. She brushes back leaves and shows him where tiny white wildflowers called bloodroot are already blooming. She stops in front of a tree and breaks off a twig. "Chew on the end of it," she says. Ben bites down on the twig, and his mouth suddenly fills with a sudden sweetness. "It tastes sort of minty." "Black birch," Mrs. Tibbets says. "People used it to make root beer. It's also got a natural painkiller in it." Ben has never thought of root beer coming from an actual plant before. Mrs. Tibbets heads farther down the trail, and he runs to keep up. When the path skirts a swampy area, Ben sees the bright green shoots of a plant sticking up out of the marshy ground, like the one behind his house. "What's that?" he asks. "Skunk cabbage." "Why do they call it that?" "Well, why do you think?" she asks. "Because skunks eat it?" "No," she laughs. "Because if you break the leaves, the smell is horrible, like a skunk. Want me to pick some for you to sample?" No thanks," Ben says. "I'll take your word for it." "Try to stay right behind me on the trail," Mrs. Tibbets advises. "There are lots of plants and critters here that wouldn't appreciate being squashed by our big feet." Ben follows her, stopping to marvel at everything she points out. Does Ben enjoy what he's doing right now? Looking back at that sentence, the word marvel. If I know that Ben is enjoying what he is doing, he's going to stop and marvel at everything. He's going to stop and really enjoy what he's seeing. This isn't the Sonoran Desert, of course, but is about 100 times more interesting than he had expected. "You getting tired?" Mrs. Tibbets looks back at him. "We've been at it for a while. We're looping back toward the house now." Ben shakes his head. He's lost track of time. "Well, we're nearly there, just beyond those red maples." She skirts around a clump of trees and stops in a clearing in front of a pool of water about 20 feet across. The sun is glinting on the water. "Here it is," she said. "Here's what?" "Where the Spadefoots will be, in a month or so." "It just looks like a big puddle." "It is. A special puddle called a vernal pool. Vernal means spring. Notice how the text told us what that word meant. Oftentimes, the text will tell you what difficult words mean, especially if you use the clues surrounding the word. The pool is only here in the spring, but a lot of things depend on it to live. Wood frogs, salamanders, fairy shrimp. Shrimp? Fairy shrimp. Tiny crustaceans about an inch long. A crustacean is a kind of animal, kind of like a crab. A crustacean, kind of like a crab or a shrimp, has no inner skeleton. It has a hard outer skeleton. Fairy shrimp, tiny crustaceans about an inch long, and spadefoots. They only breed on one night, the rainiest night in April, and then they're gone. Where? Back underground. They're very private and only come out at night. The night they breed is about the only chance you'll have to see them. One night a year, and that's it. They're almost impossible to find. You can hear them, though, on that night. Thinking back about the title, Night of the Spadefoot Toads. What does the text tell you right here in this sentence that relates to the title? If I was going to guess, I would say the title has to do with the one night a year you could see the spadefoot toads. Really? Oh yes, they make quite a racket. She sits down on a large rock by the pool and takes off her shoes and then pulls on the wading boots. Ben does the same. They are way too big for him, and when he stands up he loses his balance. Ah! He says, trying not to fall over, but he ends up sprawling in the wet muck at the edge of the pool. His hands are muddy, his forearms wet, and a rich, funky smell comes up from the murk. He tries to get up, but it's hard in the boots. He's on his hands and knees and feels stupid. He looks up at Mrs. Tibbets. She's laughing. "Oh, for Pete's sake," she says, "it's not a swimming pool." Something about the way she says it makes Ben laugh, too. She reaches down a hand and pulls him up. His arms are smeared with wet mud. He rubs them on the front of his jacket. "You look like the creature from the Black Lagoon," Mrs. Tibbets says. "Your mother will kill me." She hands him a bandana and he wipes the mud off his fingers. "At least my feet are dry," he says. Mrs. Tibbets laughs again and wades out to the middle of the pool. Ben starts to follow. "Try not to stir things up," she says. She inches along, bending down and peering into the murky water, and Ben follows behind, feeling the cool of the water beneath his boots. Ben can't figure out what she's doing. "Do you see anything?" he asks. She doesn't answer. After several minutes she says, "Look! Over here!" Ben wades over and she points at a gooey-looking blob floating in the pond. Inside the clear goo are hundreds of little black dots. "What is it?" "Wood frog eggs." "Like the one I caught?" "Who knows? Maybe she's the one who laid them." "What are the black dots?" "The eggs." "But there must be 1,000 of them." "About that many," Mrs. Tibbets says. "Most of them won't make it." "Why not?" "Because they taste so good. Yum, yum. Well, at least to snakes." Ben stares at the mass of eggs. "Cool," he says. He shakes his head at himself. That sounded more like what Ryan would say. "Very cool," Mrs. Tibbets answers. "And the spadefoots are even cooler. They're my favorite." She stands up and rubs her back, stiff from leaning over. They wade out of the murky water and put their shoes back on. It feels good to be back in sneakers. They sit on the rock for a little while. The sun warms Ben's back. "It's nice here," he says. "Yes, very nice." Without another word, Mrs. Tibbets gets up and heads down the path toward the house. "Let's get some lunch," she calls back to him. "Then I'll pay you and take you home." Ben had forgotten about everything. Oh, he'd forgotten all about the money. He'd forgotten about everything, even the birthday party. "Okay," he says happily, hurrying to catch up, toting the wet boots over his shoulder. Toting is a word here that means carrying. As they come to the side of the house by the garage, a fancy car pulls up in the driveway, and a woman wearing an expensive-looking coat gets out. Her hair is bright red. "Oh, for Pete's sake," Mrs. Tibbets mutters. I wonder what she wants. Ben, why don't you find something to do in the backyard for a couple of minutes while I talk to her?" Ben looks at Mrs. Tibbets. "It's just Tabitha, my sister-in-law," she says with a frown on her face. "Go on. It won't take long. There's no reason for you to have to talk to her." She takes Ben's boots and walks across the yard. Ben is happy for an excuse not to meet the red-headed woman. He can tell by the look on Mrs. Tibbets' face that her sister-in-law isn't someone he really wants to meet. He's almost to the walkway between the house and the garage when he hears their voices getting louder. At first, He can't really hear the words, but they both sound annoyed. He retraces his steps and stands behind the shrubs at the corner of the house. I know how you feel, Gloria, but really, it's my decision. Ben can tell that the red-headed woman is speaking. The words sound brittle, like they might break when they come out of her mouth. That right there is another example of using the text to tell you what that word brittle means. Brittle means it is easily broken. The text tells us exactly what those words mean. It's not what Thomas would have wanted, Mrs. Tibbets says. I know very well what he wanted. He asked me to wait a year. He said not to do anything for at least a year, Mrs. Tibbets says. I don't think he intended for you to sell. Not like this, anyway. And although you don't seem to care what I think, it's certainly not what I want. You may have heard a cat just meow. My kitty Goliath has decided to join us, and he might meow during this. Ben feels sneaky, but he can't help listening. It's weird. Even though he doesn't know Mrs. Tibbets all that well, something about her sharp-tongued sister-in-law alarms him. Really, Gloria, the other woman snaps, you're being pig-headed. It's best for both of us. 15 houses jammed up next to mine is not my idea of what's best for me. It won't be the same. And Thomas loved this land as it was, not with roads and houses. Oh, you act like they're going to put a nuclear waste dump here or something. Tabitha's voice sounds agitated now. Agitated is a word that means really annoyed. I could stop this, Mrs. Tibbets says. Don't you dare start with that again, the other woman snaps, her voice rising. I could, though. If you could call the state about that, the woman sputters. Really, Gloria, this is not your decision. And anyway, you need the money more than I do. Look at that house. It needs painting. I know very well what it needs. I'm only trying to help. It's help I don't really want, Tabitha. Oh, it's no use trying to reason with you. You are so stubborn. No more than you, Mrs. Tibbets says. There's a pause. Ben can feel his heart beating so loudly he's afraid they're both going to hear it. The other woman speaks again. In the end, it's my decision. Legally, this is my land, and I'm going to get the best price I can for it. You'll get your share, as Tom requested in the will, and then you can decide what you want to do with it. And remember, I don't legally owe you any more than that. I'm just honoring what my brother wanted. Ben can barely hear his teacher's response. Well, whatever you're going to do, you're going to do. I wish you wouldn't be like this. I'm afraid it's the way I am. Come inside and I'll see if I can find the papers. Ben hears the front door close. Mrs. Tibbets seems to have forgotten about him. He's breathing hard like he was in the argument himself. He wanders around back. He thinks about exploring the woods again, but he doesn't want to get too far away from the house in case Mrs. Tibbets comes looking for him. He opens the door of the tool shed a crack and peers inside. Nothing but garden tools and a big pile of empty plant containers. Outside again, he wanders over to the back of the shed. The cage underneath the lean-to is partially hidden in the shadows. He edges closer. It's made of wood and wire tightly woven into half-inch squares. A plywood wall marks off a small corner of the cage. It looks like some kind of shelter area with a small entrance. He tries to peer into the entrance, but it's just too dark. Don't go near the cage, Mrs. Tibbets had said. What kind of snakes are in there? Ben shakes the cage a little to see if he can get anything to come out. There's no movement, and maybe there's nothing in there at all. But then why did Mrs. Tibbets tell him to stay away? Ben looks around on the ground and finds a skinny stick. He pushes the stick through the wire and into a hole in the nesting area. He twists and wiggles it gently inside the hole. Ben hears a car motor start up on the other side of the garage. He pulls the stick out and flings it on the ground. He runs around the side of the house and smacks into Mrs. Tibbets, almost knocking her over. Oh, she says. Sorry, says Ben. What were you doing back there? Mrs. Tibbets says. Her voice is tense. I was just walking around looking at stuff, Ben says. It's really a horrible answer. You weren't bothering the snakes, were you? Ben shakes his head. No, I wasn't. He feels bad about lying, but nothing happened, and he doesn't want her to be mad at him. You have to promise, Mrs. Tibbets says. Don't go near that cage. She puts a hand to her chest like she's trying to calm down. She lets out a breath. I'm sorry if I yelled, but it's very important. They're not to be disturbed. Do you understand? Ben nods. Mrs. Tibbets rubs her forehead, then without a word she turns back toward the house. Ben follows her through the back door into the kitchen. It's a small room with a table just big enough for 2 chairs. A cardboard box overflowing with papers and files takes up most of the surface of the table, and 2 more boxes just like it are sitting on the floor. "Sorry about the mess," Mrs. Tibbets says, not looking at him. "I was just going through some old things." She picks up one of the boxes and carries it to some other room. Ben's heart is still pounding from his teacher's scolding. He looks at the box on the table. Balanced on top is a stack of black and white photographs. He sits in one of the chairs and leans in for a better look. Some of the pictures are yellowed and curled up on the edges. He guesses they're old. Probably as old as the photos in his grandmother's family album. Ben listens for the sound of Mrs. Tibbets' footsteps. He only hears a faint scraping in the back of the house. He takes a chance and flips through a few of the pictures. Groups of people, relatives probably, posing at holiday time or standing by the beach or leaning against old cars. Then one of a boy and a girl catches his eye. The boy looks like he's about 8 years old, younger than Ben is now, and the girl looks around 6. They're sitting on a large rock squinting into the sun. The boy, his face all scrunched up, is holding something away from himself, like he's not really sure he wants to touch it. Ben can't tell if he's laughing or upset, maybe both. He peers at the object in the boy's hands. It looks like some sort of toad. The girl has something too. Her long curly hair hangs down over her shoulders, but Ben can see that she's holding an even fatter toad underneath her chin. She's laughing. He flips over the picture and sees that someone has written in a kid's scrawl, "Tom, me, and the overtoad." He looks back at it again. He doesn't notice when Mrs. Tibbets comes back into the room. "That's Tom. Thomas, my husband." Startled, Ben drops the photo on the table. Who's the girl?" he asks. "It looks like Tabitha," she says, hurrying to the refrigerator. "How does chicken salad sound to you?" "Fine," says Ben. Neither of them say much during lunch. Maybe I should have gone to the birthday party, Ben thinks. The walk in the woods was fun, but now everything feels strange. "You did good work today," Mrs. Tibbets says, handing him an envelope. Ben peers inside. $15. "Oh, that's too much," he says. "No, it's not. It's what you earned." "Okay." Ben folds the envelope and puts it in his pocket. "Thanks." With barely another word, Mrs. Tibbets stacks the lunch dishes in the kitchen sink and leads him through the house, out the front door and back to the car. As she drives him home, she hums to herself, letting her voice fill the space where there's no talking. When she stops the car in front of his house, Ben opens the door to climb out. "Ben?" "Yes?" "I'm sorry I yelled at you about the cage." "It's okay." "There are a couple of snakes in that cage. I shouldn't have them there, really. My husband rescued them from an area being developed, and he was looking for a nature center that might take them. He was a real herpetologist." Herpetologist is a person who specializes in reptiles and amphibians, including snakes. Notice that "ist" at the end of it, herpetologist, is a Latin suffix meaning someone who performs or specializes in something. The things everyone else was afraid of, he loved. This was just before he died. It was very sudden. I shouldn't have kept them. I know I need to find a place for them. I just haven't gotten around to doing it. "What kind of snakes?" he asks. She ignores the question. "You should never bother them. Do you understand?" Ben nods again. "So enough of that," Mrs. Tibbets says. "Thank you for coming. I really needed your help." He's glad she's not mad anymore. He hates it when adults are angry. He never knows what to do or say. "It's okay. Thanks for everything." "No, thank you. And maybe we could look for those spadefoot toads when we get a good rain." "Cool," he says. Where'd that come from? He wonders. Ryan again. "Cool," Mrs. Tibbets repeats. It sounds funny coming from her. Funny, but nice.